Before we start this story, make sure you subscribe to the channel and press the notification bell so you never miss our latest updates. The summer of 1978 was heavy and restless in the small town of Millfield, Pennsylvania. It had been 4 years since President Nixon resigned, and the country was still dealing with the aftereffects of the 60s free love era. FM radios were nonstop playing Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, while teenage bedrooms were covered with Star Wars posters, fueling dreams of far-off galaxies. It was July 23rd, and by noon the temperature had already reached 93 degrees. The kind of summer heat where asphalt started bubbling, and every minute felt painfully slow. Inside a modest 2-story colonial home on Sycamore Street, 18-year-old Elizabeth Blackwell was packing her suitcase. She carefully folded her bell-bottom jeans and peasant blouses, while her 16-year-old sister Abigail lounged lazily on the twin bed beside her. The room looked exactly like a teenage girl's space in the 70s. John Travolta posters from Saturday Night Fever fought for wall space with Farrah Fawcett's iconic red swimsuit image. In the corner, a turntable stood ready, stacked with vinyl records, Fleetwood Mac, Linda Ronstadt, and Carly Simon. Elizabeth, known to everyone as Lizzie, had graduated from Millfield High School just a month earlier. She was the first in her family preparing to go to college. That September, she was set to join Penn State University to study education. Her dream was simple: return to Millfield one day and teach at the elementary school she once attended. With her auburn hair falling in soft natural waves, bright hazel eyes and freckles sprinkled across her nose, Lizzie was beautiful and intelligent. She was not only admired but also the pride of the Blackwell family. "I wish you weren't leaving," Abigail said softly, twisting a strand of her honey blonde hair. From the dresser, Rod Stewart's "You're in My Heart" played faintly on their portable radio. "Who's going to protect me from Dad when he drinks?" Abigail asked, her voice small. "Mom will," Lizzie replied, though her tone lacked real conviction. She carefully folded a denim skirt and placed it neatly in her suitcase. "And I'll be back for Thanksgiving, just 3 months." But what nobody could imagine was that Elizabeth Blackwell would never make it to college. By that very night, both Blackwell sisters would disappear, without a single trace, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a community in shock. That evening, Mary Blackwell, their mother, returned from her shift at Woolworth's department store to an eerily empty house. Her husband, Richard, was at his weekly bowling league, but the girls should have been home. The TV was on, tuned to the Love Boat. Lunch dishes sat unwashed in the sink. Mary called out for her daughters, but the only sound was the ticking of the cuckoo clock in the hallway and faint noises of Charlie's Angels drifting from the neighbor's TV. By 10 p.m., when Richard finally stumbled home, reeking of beer and cigarette smoke, Mary had already phoned all of Elizabeth and Abigail's friends. No one had seen them since mid-afternoon, when they were spotted walking down the path leading to Lake Morrison, a popular swimming spot for teenagers. Despite being drunk, Richard sobered up instantly after hearing this. He grabbed the keys to his Ford LTD and sped toward the lake. The yellow headlights of his car cut through the dark night, while crickets chirped loudly in the humid July air. At the lake, Richard found a chilling sight. The girls' bicycles were chained to a tree. Their towels lay spread out on the shore. A half-eaten pack of Twinkies and 2 bottles of Tab soda sat on the blanket, but Elizabeth and Abigail were nowhere to be seen. Richard called out their names again and again, his voice echoing across the still water until it went hoarse. By midnight, Chief Daniel Morgan of the Millfield Police Department had organized a search party. Officers with flashlights scanned the shoreline, while volunteers from town searched the nearby woods. The department's only patrol boat moved across the black surface of the lake, its spotlight beams dancing in the darkness. By dawn, the search had produced nothing but exhaustion and a growing sense of dread. The disappearance of the Blackwell sisters was the lead story on WPEN radio the next morning. As Neil Diamond's Sweet Caroline faded out, the announcer's grave voice reported the little that was known. By afternoon, their school photos were taped in shop windows along Main Street. The Millfield Chronicle carried the headline, "Local Teens Vanish from Lake Morrison." Remember, this was 1978. No Amber Alerts, no cell phones to track, no social media to spread the word instantly. Just the slow, painful process of knocking on doors, dialing numbers on rotary phones, and printing flyers on mimeograph machines that left your fingers stained purple with ink. Chief Morgan set up a command center inside the Millfield High School gym. Folding tables were lined with push-button phones, where volunteers logged every call. On the wall, a large county map was pinned with colored tacks marking areas already searched. The air inside smelled of strong coffee and cigarette smoke as town residents gathered, desperate to help. In the first few days, several leads surfaced. A gas station attendant reported seeing a dark-colored van with out-of-state plates near the lake that afternoon. 3 teenagers admitted they heard screams from the North Shore, though they confessed they had been drinking Coors beer stolen from one of their fathers. And Elizabeth's close friend, Jessica Turner, told police that Lizzie had mentioned having a secret boyfriend, an older man, not from Millfield. Chief Morgan and his small team of 4 officers worked around the clock. They checked license plates with state police, interviewed everyone who had been at the lake, and even dragged the bottom of Lake Morrison, hopping for answers. The police gathered every piece of physical evidence they could find. There were cigarette butts lying near the girls, towels, tire marks on the dirt road leading down to the lake, and fingerprints lifted from the soda bottles. But without the advanced forensic tools that exist today, none of these clues led anywhere. Richard and Mary Blackwell soon appeared on the local television news. Mary clutched a tissue tightly in her hand, her face streaked with tears, while Richard looked pale, exhausted, and deeply broken. Mary's voice cracked as she pleaded, "Please, if anyone knows anything about our girls, please come forward. We just want them home." As the days stretched into weeks, the investigation began to slow down. The FBI assigned an agent to assist, but because there was no hard evidence proving an abduction across state lines, their role was limited. Even psychics came from as far away as Philadelphia, offering desperate theories to the grieving parents. One psychic claimed the girls were trapped in a mountain cabin. Another insisted they had run away to California to live in a commune. Every one of these leads turned out to be false. By Labor Day, when Elizabeth should have been settling into her dorm at Penn State, the daily search efforts had dwindled away. The command center was taken down, and the high school gymnasium returned to its usual use as students prepared for the new school year. Officially, the Blackwell case remained open, but in reality, the investigation slowed to a trickle, just occasional follow-ups and a quiet review of the same old evidence. What no one realized at the time was that the truth behind the girls' disappearance was darker than anyone could have imagined. And those answers would stay buried for nearly 40 years. As the 1970s faded into the 1980s, the case grew colder and colder. Posters with Elizabeth and Abigail's smiling faces slowly disappeared from store windows, replaced by colorful ads for Cabbage Patch Kids and flyers about the town's bicentennial celebration. For Millfield, the Blackwell case became a dark chapter, a cautionary tale parents repeated to their children, warning them not to wander off alone. Mary Blackwell never recovered from losing her daughters. She quit her job at Woolworth's and rarely left the family home on Sycamore Street. Neighbors often saw her sitting quietly on the front porch, staring blankly at the road, as if waiting for her girls to come riding home on their bicycles. Richard coped in his own way. He buried himself in work at the paper mill, taking double shifts whenever possible, and at night he drowned his pain in alcohol at Brady's Tavern, stumbling home long after Mary had cried herself to sleep. On the first anniversary of the disappearance, Mary organized a candlelight vigil at Lake Morrison. Nearly the whole town came out, holding white candles that flickered in the warm summer breeze as a local minister led prayers for Elizabeth and Abigail. The following year, the crowd was smaller. By the 5th anniversary, only Mary, Richard, and a handful of the girls' closest friends stood by the lakeshore to remember them. Each year on their birthdays, Mary continued a heartbreaking ritual. She baked a cake and set the dining table for 5 herself: Richard, Elizabeth, Abigail, and Chief Morgan. The chief came faithfully every year, bringing along the case file, which by then was stored in a battered cardboard box in the basement of the police station. He would sit with them, review the evidence once more, and reassure the grieving parents that the case was still open, even though there was nothing new to find. Through the Reagan years and into the Clinton era, the Blackwell case gathered dust. Officers who had worked the original investigation retired or moved away. Chief Morgan himself passed away in 1993, taking with him his personal knowledge of the case. A new police chief, a young man from Philadelphia with no personal connection to the events of 1978, eventually moved the files into the archives, stored alongside records of old prohibition raids and long-forgotten town council meetings. Mary Blackwell passed away in 2004, never knowing what became of her daughters. Richard, suffering from cirrhosis of the liver, died just 6 months later. The two were buried side by side in Millfield Cemetery under a headstone that read, "Beloved parents of Elizabeth and Abigail." On either side of their graves sat 2 smaller markers, memorials for the daughters whose bodies had never been found. The family home on Sycamore Street was eventually sold to a young couple from Pittsburgh, who renovated it completely. They had no idea of the house's tragic history until neighbors told them about the Blackwell girls. While cleaning out the attic, the couple found a box filled with the sisters' belongings: yearbooks, diaries, and photographs carefully preserved by Mary. Unsure what to do with these artifacts of grief, they donated the box to the Millfield Historical Society, where everything was cataloged and stored away. Meanwhile, the world around Millfield changed. The Berlin Wall fell. The internet revolutionized communication. Cell phones replaced pay phones. DNA testing transformed forensic science. Across the country, cold cases once thought unsolvable were finally being cracked open with technology that seemed unimaginable back in 1978. And then, in the spring of 2017, nearly 39 years after Elizabeth and Abigail vanished, a startling discovery at Lake Morrison breathed new life into the Blackwell case. It began with a drought, the worst in Pennsylvania's recorded history. As the water level at Lake Morrison fell to historic lows, parts of the lakebed that had been hidden for generations were suddenly exposed. A group of environmental science students from Millfield Community College, out studying the effects of the drought, stumbled upon something shocking near what used to be the north shore of the lake, now lying nearly 30 yards from the current waterline. One of the students spotted an object sticking out of the cracked, dry mud. At first glance, she thought it was nothing more than driftwood bleached pale after years underwater. As she bent down to get a closer look, shock ran through her. It wasn't just debris at the bottom of the lake. It was human remains, part of a skeleton trapped in the thick sediment. The Millfield Police Department quickly secured the scene, now better equipped with modern forensic methods and advanced technology. Soon after, the county medical examiner arrived with a forensic anthropologist from the University of Pittsburgh. With extreme care, they began the excavation and uncovered not one, but two sets of human bones. The remains had been surprisingly well preserved, thanks to the cold and oxygen-deprived environment deep in the lake. Normally, weather and animals would scatter such evidence, but here the bodies had been shielded. Early analysis revealed that the remains were of two young females, one around 18 years old and the other a bit younger. Both had been killed by blunt force blows to the head. The anthropologist further estimated that the victims had been underwater for several decades. Heavy stones had been attached to their bodies using electrical cord. Over the years, as the cord weakened and broke down, the bones had shifted with the movement of the lake's currents. Detective Samantha Riley, who had joined the Millfield Police Department just 3 years earlier, was handed the case. As she read through the medical examiner's initial findings, she felt a strange sense of recognition. Raised in Philadelphia, Riley didn't have any personal ties to the case, but she remembered seeing an exhibit at the Millfield Historical Society about the town's most infamous unsolved mystery, the disappearance of the Blackwell sisters. Determined to follow her instincts, Riley drove to the Historical Society, which was housed in a restored Victorian mansion on Elm Street. There, she met Harold Jenkins, the elderly curator who had lived in Millfield his whole life. When Riley asked about the Blackwell sisters, Jenkins led her into a small back room. Inside a dusty glass case were photographs of Elizabeth and Abigail, smiling brightly from years past. "I was in high school when they vanished," Jenkins told her. "Everyone thought they had been kidnapped, maybe taken across state lines. Nobody ever guessed they were right here in the lake all along." Riley then obtained dental records that had been kept in the original case file. The medical examiner confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. The bodies from the lake were indeed Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell. But while identifying the victims was an important breakthrough, it was only the first step. Riley now faced the nearly impossible challenge of solving a murder that happened long before she was even born. Most of the original investigators were either deceased or unreachable. Witnesses' memories had likely faded, and much of the evidence had been lost or deteriorated over time. Still, Riley felt a deep responsibility, not only to give justice to the Blackwell sisters, but also to help a community that had never truly healed from their disappearance. She began by digitizing everything in the old case file: police reports, witness statements, photographs, and notes. She organized the material into a detailed timeline showing the sisters' last known movements and created a database of every person mentioned in the investigation. She even reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, asking for help in building a psychological profile of the killer based on the available evidence. One of Riley's first interviews was with Jessica Turner, now known as Jessica Mitchell. Back in high school, she had been Elizabeth's closest friend. Now in her 60s, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Jessica still recalled the summer of '78 with painful clarity. I've carried the guilt all these years, Jessica admitted quietly to Riley in her living room, filled with family photographs and greenhouse plants. I knew Lizzie was seeing someone, but I promised not to say anything. If I had spoken up sooner, maybe things would have been different. Riley leaned forward. What man, Mrs. Mitchell? Jessica twisted her wedding ring nervously. She never told me his name. She said it was complicated and that I wouldn't understand. But she did mention he was older and they had to keep it a secret because people wouldn't approve. I always thought it might be a teacher or someone like that. This lined up with the original statements Jessica had given years ago, but Riley pressed for more information. Did Elizabeth ever mention where they met or how long they had been seeing each other? Jessica closed her eyes, searching her memory from nearly 4 decades earlier. I remember her saying he gave her rides home sometimes, and then there was this necklace, a small silver heart. She said it was a gift from him. Riley quickly made a note about the necklace, something that had never appeared in the original reports. She then asked about Abigail. Abby worshipped Lizzie, Jessica explained. She followed her everywhere, wanted to be just like her. If Lizzie had a secret boyfriend, Abby would have known about it. With this new lead, Riley revisited the evidence recovered from the lake. Among the items found were a charm bracelet, a class ring confirmed to belong to Elizabeth, and a silver heart necklace, tarnished after years underwater but still intact. Alongside these were fragments of clothing and the deteriorated electrical cord that had been used to tie the stones to the victims. Riley knew that modern forensic tools could provide answers that investigators in 1978 never could. She sent the evidence to the state crime lab, requesting a full DNA analysis and testing for any chemical traces that might have survived. While waiting for the lab results, Riley kept pushing forward. She spoke with other friends and acquaintances of the Blackwell sisters, but most people had little new information to share. Still, one name came up repeatedly in conversations: James Harper, who had been a senior when Elizabeth was a junior. Several people from Millfield remembered that James Harper had once asked Elizabeth to the prom, but she turned him down. After graduation, Harper joined the Navy, and according to what locals believed, never came back to town. Riley eventually tracked him to a suburb of Chicago, where he now worked as an electrical engineer. In his late 50s, Harper appeared truly stunned when Riley told him the Blackwell sisters' remains had been recovered. He admitted he had been interested in Elizabeth, but explained that she told him she was already seeing someone else. When Riley pressed for more information, Harper recalled that Elizabeth once mentioned meeting her boyfriend at the place where her father worked. That detail immediately caught Riley's attention. Richard Blackwell had been employed at the Millfield Paper Mill, a facility that shut down in 1996 before being demolished to make space for a shopping center. Following this lead, Riley obtained employment records from the mill's archives. She carefully reviewed the names of men who could have crossed paths with Elizabeth at the time. Meanwhile, the state crime lab sent back its findings. The results were chilling. The electrical cord used to tie the heavy stones to the girls' bodies still carried fragments of DNA. Protected by years underwater, it wasn't a full profile, but it was enough to be matched if a suspect's DNA was later obtained. In addition, chemical testing on the sisters' clothing revealed traces of compounds used in the pulping process at the paper mill. This strongly suggested the girls had been in contact with someone, or something, connected to the mill shortly before their deaths. Piece by piece, Riley's theory began to take shape. Elizabeth had been secretly involved with a man linked to the paper mill. That man somehow convinced both sisters to meet him in a secluded spot, where he murdered them and dumped their bodies in the lake. But who was he, and could he still be alive after nearly 40 years? The unexpected breakthrough came from the Blackwell family belongings stored at the Millfield Historical Society. Among Elizabeth's possessions was a diary, with entries running from January to July 1978. The final entry was dated July 22nd, just one day before the sisters vanished. As Riley carefully read through the handwritten pages, a disturbing truth began to emerge. Elizabeth frequently referred to someone she called R. She described their secret relationship, writing about the thrill but also the guilt she felt. In one entry, she noted, R says we can go away together, just the three of us. He says he can get a job anywhere with his skills and no one would ever have to know. But what about Mom? The last entry, dated July 22nd, was the most revealing. Elizabeth wrote, R says everything is arranged tomorrow at the lake. A new start for all of us. Abby's excited but scared too. I told her it will be an adventure. R says once we're gone, we can be a real family. No more hiding. Riley froze as the meaning became clear. She compared the diary notes with the paper mill's employment records. Richard Blackwell himself had worked in the pulping department. His supervisor's old evaluations described him as skilled but hot-tempered, and they included reports of inappropriate behavior toward female employees. Riley dug further into the original case file and discovered something shocking, something that had either been overlooked or ignored. Richard Blackwell was the one who reported finding the girls' bicycles and belongings at Lake Morrison. But how did he know exactly where to look when the lake had multiple popular swimming spots? The picture was turning clearer and far darker than anyone in Millfield had ever imagined. Riley was beginning to believe that Richard Blackwell had been in a secret, abusive relationship with his own daughter, Elizabeth. When she prepared to leave for college, Richard convinced both sisters to meet him at the lake, likely promising them a new beginning together. Instead, he killed them and sank their bodies beneath the water. But Riley knew theory wasn't enough. Richard Blackwell had been dead for years. She needed physical proof to finally close the case. The only way forward was to exhume his remains and see if his DNA matched the partial profile from the electrical cord. At first, the district attorney hesitated. Disturbing a grave based on a theory was a heavy step, but once Riley presented Elizabeth's diary and all the supporting evidence, approval was granted. While the exhumation order went through, Riley continued digging into Richard's past. She uncovered another alarming detail. In 1977, a year before his daughters disappeared, Richard had been questioned about an incident involving a 17-year-old female employee at the paper mill. The girl claimed he had made inappropriate advances toward her. No charges were filed after Richard dismissed it as a misunderstanding, and the girl's family quietly moved away. Riley tracked the woman down. Now living in Arizona, she agreed to a phone interview. What she said made Riley's suspicions even stronger. Richard Blackwell tried to start a sexual relationship with me when I was 17, the woman recalled. When I refused, he became threatening. He told me he had special relationships with his daughters and that they understood him in ways other women didn't. It was terrifying, but back then, people didn't talk about those things. Her testimony fit perfectly with the disturbing pattern Riley was uncovering. And then came the final confirmation. When Richard Blackwell's remains were exhumed and tested, the DNA matched the partial profile found on the electrical cord. The killer had finally been identified. On a gray November morning in 2017, Detective Samantha Riley stepped up to the podium inside Millfield Town Hall. Flashbulbs from cameras burst across the room, the air thick with anticipation. After nearly 4 decades, the Blackwell case was about to be laid to rest. "The investigation has concluded," Riley announced firmly. Richard Blackwell, father of Elizabeth and Abigail, murdered his own daughters and concealed their bodies in Lake Morrison. Gasps rippled through the audience. Riley continued, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of what she was about to say. "Evidence strongly indicates that Richard Blackwell had been sexually abusing at least one of his daughters. When Elizabeth prepared to leave for college, threatening both his control and the risk of exposure, he silenced her and Abigail with violence. He then participated in the search efforts, hiding in plain sight for the rest of his life." The revelation stunned Millfield. Neighbors, classmates, and old family friends were left reeling, forced to reconcile fond memories of the Blackwell family with this horrifying truth. Some recalled Richard's strict and possessive behavior and Mary Blackwell's subdued silence. Others remembered how Richard insisted on driving the girls everywhere, rarely allowing them independence. Now, those unsettling memories fit into a much darker picture. A memorial service was held by the lake where the girls had been found. Hundreds gathered. Some had joined the desperate search back in 1978. Others were too young but had grown up hearing whispers of the case. Flowers floated gently on the water's surface as Jessica Mitchell, Elizabeth's childhood friend, whispered goodbye. The Historical Society created a permanent exhibit, not to sensationalize, but to remember. Artifacts, photographs, and diary pages stood as reminders of lives cut short. Elizabeth and Abigail were reinterred in Millfield Cemetery, not beside their parents, but together in a separate plot. A new headstone bore the simple words, "Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell, beloved sisters, finally at peace." For Detective Riley, the case was more than a professional triumph. It became a mission. She began advocating for cold case investigations nationwide, often citing the Blackwell sisters as proof that justice delayed does not mean justice denied. Millfield itself was transformed. A crisis center for victims of abuse was founded, named Liz's Place in Elizabeth's memory. Schools adopted stronger programs on recognizing and reporting abuse. The police established a dedicated cold case unit. The lake that had hidden the sisters' bodies for nearly 40 years became a place of remembrance. A small plaque told their story, not as an unsolved mystery, but as a hard truth finally uncovered. In the end, it wasn't advanced technology alone that solved the Blackwell case. It was the careful preservation of the past, a teenager's diary, faded employment records, photographs in shoeboxes, and the courage of those who finally spoke. Combined with modern forensics, these fragments formed a truth that could no longer stay submerged. Justice had come, late, painful, but real. And so the Blackwell case was closed. But their legacy endured, in scholarships for future advocates, in the crisis center that bore Elizabeth's name, and in the quiet determination of a community that vowed never to let such suffering go unnoticed again. As Riley often said in her lectures, "The truth, like bodies in a lake, may be submerged for years, but eventually it rises to the surface, and when it does, it brings with it healing, change, and remembrance." Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell never lived to see adulthood, but their story lived on, and finally they had found peace.